The classified ad had been running in the Mystic Weekly for 3 months straight. $80,000 a year for a private driver position at the Whitmore estate. Nobody wanted it. Samuel Carter stared at the crumpled newspaper in his calloused hands, the weight of unpaid bills crushing his shoulders. His thumb hovered over his phone before finally pressing call. When the elderly voice answered, Samuel didn't know he was about to step through a door that would change everything. Sometimes the jobs nobody wants become the ones that save your life. The Whitmore mansion rose from the Connecticut coastline like a Gothic monument to loneliness. Samuel parked his rusted sedan outside the iron gates, watching October fog roll through the stone archways. The estate stretched across 15 acres of manicured grounds. But something about it felt abandoned, as if the very walls had absorbed decades of silence. Arthur, the butler who'd answered his call, stood waiting at the main entrance. The man had to be 70, his formal bearing softened by eyes that held both warning and sympathy. "Mr. Carter," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's been waiting." The foyer swallowed sound. Samuel's footsteps on the marble floor seemed to disappear into the vaulted ceiling, absorbed by heavy velvet drapes and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. The air tasted of old money and older grief. Arthur led him through corridors lined with closed doors, past rooms draped in white sheets like ghosts of a life once lived. The house wasn't just quiet. It was holding its breath. Margaret Whitmore stood in the study, her back to them, facing windows that overlooked the gray Atlantic. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Samuel's monthly rent. Her silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun. When she turned, Samuel caught his breath. She was beautiful in the way winter storms are beautiful, sharp, distant, and potentially devastating. Her eyes, the color of slate, carried a weight he recognized. It was the same weight he saw in his own mirror every morning. "You need this job," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice had the quality of someone who hadn't used it much lately, slightly rough at the edges. "I need someone who won't ask questions. Arthur will explain the duties." She moved past him without another word, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive perfume and something else, the metallic taste of suppressed tears. Arthur watched her go with an expression of profound sadness before turning to Samuel. 8:30 every morning, without fail. You'll drive her to 4 locations. 30 minutes at each, never more, never less. She won't speak to you. She won't explain. But she needs someone reliable. Arthur paused, studying Samuel's worn jacket and the defeat in his shoulders. Someone who understands that sometimes silence is all we have left. Samuel thought of Grace, his 7-year-old daughter, who hadn't smiled in 6 months. He thought of the eviction notice taped to his apartment door. He nodded. The first weeks passed in a blur of routine that felt like drowning in slow motion. Samuel would drop Grace at school each morning, watching her walk through the gates with her little shoulders hunched, her backpack seeming too heavy for her small frame. She'd stopped talking about her mother 3 months after the funeral, but Samuel knew she still set a place for her at their tiny kitchen table. The therapist said it was normal. Nothing about their life felt normal anymore. His apartment in the rougher part of Mystic was falling apart, peeling paint, temperamental heating, a kitchen window that wouldn't close properly. After Laura's medical bills and the funeral costs, it was all he could afford. The walls were thin enough that he could hear Mrs. Chen next door crying at night, mourning her own losses. The whole building seemed populated by people nursing wounds that wouldn't heal. At exactly 8:30 each morning, Samuel would pull the black town car around to the mansion's front entrance. Margaret would emerge precisely on time, dressed impeccably, her face a mask of composure that never cracked. She'd slide into the back seat without acknowledgement, placing a folded piece of paper on the seat beside him, the day's destinations written in elegant script. The stops never varied in their strangeness. First, Mystic General Hospital, where she'd sit in the parking lot for exactly 30 minutes, staring at the pediatric wing. Then to Fisher, Hartley, and Associates, a law firm downtown where she'd disappear inside but always return with red-rimmed eyes. The third stop was always the abandoned lot on Riverside Drive, where the foundation of a house stood like broken teeth. She'd stand there, arms wrapped around herself, until the 30 minutes expired. The final stop was Connecticut Mutual Bank, where she'd conduct business with the efficiency of someone running from something. Samuel learned to navigate her silence like a ship through fog. He watched her in the rearview mirror, noting the white-knuckled grip on her purse, the way her breath would catch when they passed certain streets, how she'd close her eyes when ambulance sirens wailed past them. He began to understand that Margaret Whitmore wasn't cold, she was frozen, trapped in ice of her own making. The silence in the car became its own language. At first, it was suffocating, pressing against Samuel's chest like a physical weight. Margaret would sit rigidly in the back seat, her gaze fixed on something beyond the window that only she could see. Samuel found himself matching his breathing to hers, slow and measured, as if they were both trying not to disturb something fragile and dangerous. By the fourth week, the quality of the silence began to change. It was no longer the absence of sound, but the presence of understanding. When Margaret's breathing would quicken at the hospital, Samuel would take a longer route to the law firm, giving her time to compose herself. When her hands trembled after visiting the empty lot, he'd adjust the heating without being asked. These small kindnesses went unacknowledged, but not unnoticed. He could see it in the way her shoulders would relax slightly, the way she'd sometimes meet his eyes in the mirror for a fraction of a second before looking away. There were moments when the weight of their combined grief seemed to fill the car like water, threatening to drown them both. Samuel would think about Laura, about her laugh that could fill a room, about how she'd dance in the kitchen while making breakfast. Margaret, unaware of his thoughts but perhaps sensing their tenor, would sometimes let out a breath that sounded like a sob cut short. They were two strangers, sharing a space smaller than most people's bathrooms, yet somehow it felt like they were the only two people in the world who understood this particular flavor of loss. Arthur began leaving coffee for Samuel in the mornings, good coffee, not the instant stuff he was used to. Sometimes there'd be a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, made with ingredients Samuel couldn't pronounce. These gestures felt like messages in bottles, acknowledgments that Samuel was seen, that his presence mattered in this house of shadows. One afternoon, Grace called the school nurse, claiming she felt sick. Samuel had to pick her up early, and with no one to watch her, he had no choice but to bring her along for Margaret's afternoon rounds. Grace sat in the front seat, silent and pale, her strawberry blonde hair hanging like a curtain around her face. When Margaret emerged from the house and saw the child, she stopped. For a moment, something flickered across her face, not anger, but a pain so raw that Samuel almost looked away. Margaret got in the car without comment, but Samuel noticed her watching Grace in the reflection of the window. At each stop, Grace would draw in a small notebook, her pencil moving in quick, nervous strokes. When they reached the empty lot, Grace suddenly spoke, her voice small but clear. "My mom liked empty spaces." She said they were full of possibilities. Margaret's sharp intake of breath was the loudest sound she'd made in weeks. The rain came sudden and hard that Tuesday, turning the October afternoon into premature night. They were parked outside the hospital, watching the water cascade down the windshield, when Samuel finally broke their unspoken agreement. "Do you ever just want to talk?" The words came out before he could stop them, hanging in the air like a challenge. Margaret was quiet for so long that Samuel began to compose an apology. Then, barely audible over the rain, "I'm not used to talking anymore." "Neither is Grace," Samuel said, glancing at the empty passenger seat where his daughter had sat the week before. "Her teacher says she hasn't spoken in class since the start of the school year." "How did she die?" Margaret asked. And Samuel realized it was the first personal question either of them had asked. "Cancer. Pancreatic. 6 months from diagnosis to..." He couldn't finish. Grace was with her at the end. "Laura made me promise to let her say goodbye. I don't know if that was right or wrong." "There is no right or wrong with grief," Margaret said. "There's only surviving it or not." They sat in silence again, but it was different now, warmer, like sharing a blanket. Margaret's hand moved slightly on the seat, not reaching for anything, just acknowledging the weight of what had been shared. "The pediatric ward," she said finally. "My son was there for 3 days before." She stopped, shaking her head. "I come here to punish myself. 30 minutes, no more, no less." Like a prescription, Samuel wanted to tell her that punishment wasn't medicine, but who was he to talk? He punished himself every day with what-ifs and should-haves. Instead, he said, "Grace punishes herself with silence. I punish myself with working." Maybe we're all just trying to control something in a world that proved we control nothing. Margaret leaned forward slightly, and for the first time, Samuel saw her really look at him, not through him or past him, but at him. Your daughter. Does she like to draw? It's the only thing that seems to help, Samuel admitted. But we can't afford, art supplies are expensive. Margaret said nothing more that day, but something had shifted, like tectonic plates moving deep underground, preparing for change. The art supply store on Main Street was the kind of place Samuel had walked past 100 times, but never entered. The window displays showed palettes and brushes that seemed to belong to a different world, one where people had time and money for hobbies. But Grace had been particularly withdrawn that week, and Samuel found himself standing outside, calculating whether he could skip lunches for a month to afford a basic set of watercolors. Margaret emerged from the bank earlier than usual that day, and instead of getting in the car, she stood beside it. "There's an errand," she said, the most words she'd spoken unprompted. She directed him to the art store, and when he parked, she gestured for him to follow her inside. The shop smelled of paper and possibility. Margaret moved through the aisles with surprising purpose, selecting items with the efficiency of someone who knew quality. A professional watercolor set, brushes that felt like silk, paper thick enough to hold dreams. The total made Samuel's stomach clench, but Margaret handed over her credit card without hesitation. "For your daughter," she said simply. "Children shouldn't be punished for their grief." That evening, when Samuel presented the supplies to Grace, her eyes widened the first real emotion he'd seen in weeks. She opened the box with trembling hands, running her fingers over the pristine colors like they were precious stones. Then she looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Mom said sad colors make the happy ones brighter," she whispered, the longest sentence she'd spoken since the funeral. "She said that's why rainy days make sunny ones feel special." Samuel pulled her close, feeling her small body shake with suppressed sobs. Over her head, he saw the first painting she'd done after Laura's death, a gray landscape with a single, brilliant yellow flower. He understood then that Grace hadn't stopped feeling. She'd just been waiting for the right tools to express what words couldn't capture. The next morning, Margaret noticed the paint under Grace's fingernails when Samuel brought her along again, another sick day that the school nurse had stopped questioning. This time, Margaret didn't just watch Grace through the window's reflection. She turned slightly, observing the girl's careful sketches. "May I see?" Margaret asked, her voice gentle in a way Samuel hadn't heard before. Grace hesitated, then held up her notebook. The drawing showed two figures sitting in a car, surrounded by rain. But inside the car was filled with golden light. Margaret studied it for a long moment, then said, "You see light where others might only see storms. That's a gift." Grace smiled, small, tentative, but real. "My mom taught me to look for it." "Your mother was wise," Margaret said, and Samuel heard the crack in her voice, like ice beginning to thaw. That afternoon, at the empty lot, Margaret stood in her usual spot. But this time she spoke. "This was supposed to be Michael's house. My son. He was going to build it when he got clean." She touched the crumbling foundation with one gloved hand. "He never got clean." Samuel wanted to offer comfort, but he knew how hollow words could be. Instead, he stood beside her, letting their shadows merge on the broken concrete. Grace, who had followed unbidden, knelt and placed a small painted stone on the foundation, a habit Laura had taught her, leaving beauty in broken places. Margaret picked up the stone, studying the tiny rainbow Grace had painted on its surface. "How old was he?" she asked. 24, Margaret replied, the number heavy as a tombstone. "He was 24, and I was so busy building empires that I didn't see him crumbling." They ate dinner together that night, the first time Margaret had invited them to stay. The mansion's kitchen, which Arthur revealed hadn't been used for a proper meal in 2 years, came alive with warmth and the smell of his legendary pot roast. Grace, emboldened by Margaret's interest in her art, had brought her new watercolors and was painting at the massive oak table while the adults talked. Michael loved to draw too, Margaret said, watching Grace work. Architecture, mostly. He wanted to design homes for families, places where people could be happy. Her voice caught. He said our house was too big for happiness to find its way in. Arthur, who had been silent until now, placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. He was happy here once, ma'am. When he was young, this house has seen joy. Before I drove his father away with my ambition. Before I chose board meetings over baseball games. Margaret's voice was bitter. I built a real estate empire and lost my family. What kind of success is that? Samuel thought about his own failures, the overtime shifts that meant missed bedtime stories, the exhaustion that made him short-tempered with Laura when she was sick. We all have regrets, he said. The question is whether we let them bury us or teach us. Grace looked up from her painting. Mom said broken things can be beautiful. Like in Japan, where they fix cracks with gold. Kintsugi, Margaret whispered, staring at the child. The art of precious scars. Can you show me? Grace asked. And something in Margaret's face transformed a dawning that maybe, just maybe, she could still offer something to the world. The next week, Margaret brought a broken ceramic bowl and a kit she'd ordered from Japan. As the town car moved through its routine stops, she taught Grace about kintsugi in the back seat, their heads bent together over the fractured pieces. Samuel watched in the mirror as Margaret's hands, so used to signing contracts and building walls, gently showed Grace how to trace the cracks with gold. The bowl was never perfect to begin with, Margaret explained. Nothing is. But when we acknowledge the breaks, when we fill them with something precious, we create a new kind of beauty, one that tells a story. Like people, Grace said, focused on her work. We all have cracks. Margaret's eyes met Samuel's in the mirror. Yes, like people. As November arrived, bringing shorter days and longer shadows, their strange trio had developed its own rhythm. Grace came along on days when school felt too heavy, and Margaret had stopped pretending not to expect her. Arthur began packing lunches for 3. The silence in the car had transformed into something comfortable, punctuated by Grace's observations and Margaret's gradually loosening reserve. But Samuel had started noticing things on their drives through the older parts of Mystic, the Hispanic neighborhood near the waterfront. Eviction notices multiplying like cancer on apartment doors. Families he recognized from Grace's school loading possessions into trucks. The community garden, where Laura used to take Grace to plant tomatoes, had been bulldozed, a sign announcing future site of Whitmore Towers' luxury waterfront living. He'd kept quiet, telling himself it wasn't his business. But when he saw Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd babysat Grace when Laura was in chemotherapy, crying outside her apartment with an eviction notice in her weathered hands, something in him snapped. The next morning, the silence in the car felt different, charged, like the air before lightning strikes. Margaret noticed. Of course she noticed. She'd become attuned to the rhythms of their shared space. Something's wrong, she said. Not a question. Samuel's hands tightened on the wheel. Do you know Mrs. Rodriguez? She lives on Wharf Street. Or she did. Margaret's reflection in the mirror went very still. She watched Grace when my wife was dying. She'd make her arroz con leche and sing old songs from Puerto Rico. Grace didn't understand the words, but she understood the love. His voice grew harder. Yesterday, she was evicted. Your company's name was on the notice. The silence that followed was different from all their previous silences. This one had teeth. I don't handle the residential division personally, Margaret began. You're destroying lives, Samuel interrupted, the words erupting from months of suppressed frustration. These aren't just properties, they're homes. Communities. Mrs. Rodriguez has lived there for 30 years. Her whole life is in that neighborhood. It's business, Margaret said. But her voice lacked conviction. Is it? Samuel pulled the car over. Something he'd never done before. He turned to face her directly. You sit outside that hospital punishing yourself for not seeing your son's pain. How can you not see the pain you're causing now? Margaret's face went white, then red. How dare you? I dare because I've watched you for months, trying to make amends with ghosts, while creating more ghosts for other people. Samuel's voice broke. You want to honor Michael's memory? He wanted to build homes for families. You're tearing them apart. Grace, who was with them that day, had shrunk into her seat, but she suddenly spoke up. Mrs. Rodriguez taught me that home isn't just walls. It's where your memories live. Margaret looked at the child, then at Samuel, and something in her carefully constructed armor finally shattered completely. She put her face in her hands and wept, harsh, ugly sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long buried. "I don't know how to stop," she gasped between sobs. "I've been running the numbers for so long, I forgot they represent people. I turned people into percentages because percentages can't die on you. They can't disappoint you or leave you." Arthur, who had been waiting at the house, must have sensed something was wrong. He appeared at the car window, opening Margaret's door without a word. She fell into his arms like a child. This woman who commanded boardrooms and controlled millions. "It's time, ma'am," Arthur said gently. "It's time to remember who you were before the grief made you forget." That evening, Margaret called an emergency meeting of her board. Samuel waited outside the conference room, Grace doing homework beside him, listening to the raised voices within. When Margaret emerged 3 hours later, she looked exhausted but somehow lighter. "I've halted the Wharf Street development," she said, "and I'm reviewing all our residential policies. It won't be popular. I might lose the company, but you'll find yourself," Samuel said. Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she smiled. It was small and sad and beautiful, like Grace's paintings. Maybe that's worth more than any empire. The next weeks were a whirlwind of change. Margaret didn't just halt the evictions. She went to each displaced family personally, offering not just apologies but solutions. She converted the planned luxury development into affordable housing, keeping the existing residents in place. She hired local contractors for renovations, creating jobs in the community she'd almost destroyed. Samuel drove her to meetings that were different now, not with lawyers and bankers, but with community leaders, social workers, teachers. Mrs. Rodriguez, skeptical at first, became one of Margaret's fiercest advocates when she saw the genuine change. "Mija," she told Margaret, using the Spanish endearment for daughter, "we all lose our way. It's finding it again that matters." Margaret established the Michael Whitmore Foundation, focused on addiction recovery and family support services. The empty lot where Michael's house would have stood became a memorial garden, designed by local high school students based on the architectural sketches found in Michael's old room sketches Margaret hadn't been able to look at until now. Arthur watched all of this with quiet pride, occasionally catching Samuel's eye with a nod that said, "This is who she used to be." Grace, meanwhile, had become Margaret's unofficial art therapist. They worked on kintsugi projects together, fixing broken items donated by the community. Each piece, once repaired with gold, was auctioned to fund the foundation. Grace's artist statement for the collection read, "Every crack tells a story. Every repair is an act of love." The Whitmore estate had stood like a fortress against the world for 3 years, its gates locked, its gardens maintained but never enjoyed. As December arrived, bringing the first snow of winter, Margaret stood in the main foyer, looking at the shrouded furniture, the closed-off rooms. "This place is too big for one person," she said to Samuel and Arthur. Michael was right about that. "What are you thinking, ma'am?" Arthur asked, though his small smile suggested he already knew. "A community garden. The grounds are certainly large enough. And the ballroom, it could be an after-school program space. Art classes for children, like Grace." She turned to Samuel. Would people come? Samuel thought about the families in the Wharf Street neighborhood, the children with nowhere safe to play, the elderly with no gardens to tend. They'd come, but it can't feel like charity. It has to be theirs too. So began the transformation. Not just of the estate, but of Margaret herself. She worked alongside volunteers, her manicured hands deep in soil, planting seedlings in the greenhouse. She learned names not of board members or investors, but of children and grandmothers and struggling single parents. The mansion's kitchen, once silent, now rang with the laughter of cooking classes, led by Mrs. Rodriguez. Grace painted a mural in what was becoming the community art room, a tree with golden cracks running through its trunk, each branch holding a different family's story. Margaret often stood before it, tracing the golden lines with her fingers, whispering what might have been prayers or apologies or promises. The Wharf Street families were skeptical at first. Trust, once broken, doesn't repair easily. even with gold. But as winter deepened, they began to come. First, the children, drawn by Grace's art classes and the promise of warm spaces to play. Then their parents, tentatively joining the gardening planning committees for spring. Finally, the elderly, lured by Arthur's tea service and the quiet company of others who understood loss. Samuel watched Margaret bloom in reverse from the frozen woman he'd met in October to someone who laughed when children tracked mud through her marble foyer, who learned Spanish curse words from the teenagers, who held babies while their mothers attended job training workshops in what used to be the formal dining room. The car rides continued, but they were different now. The hospital visits became meetings with addiction counselors. The law firm appointments were about setting up nonprofit structures. The empty lot was now a building site, not for Michael's house, but for a recovery center bearing his name. And the bank visits were about microloans for small businesses in the community. Spring arrived early that year, or maybe it just seemed that way because people were ready for it. The community garden's opening day brought half of Mystic to the estate. Tents dotted the grounds, local bands played, and the smell of grilled corn and hamburgers replaced the musty silence that had haunted the property for so long. Samuel found Margaret standing alone by the memorial garden, looking at Michael's sketch that had been etched into a stone monument, a simple house with big windows, and the words, "Home is where healing happens," written in his hand. He would have been 30 this year, she said softly. He would have been proud, Samuel replied. Margaret shook her head. I don't know about that. But maybe he would have understood that I finally learned what he tried to teach me, that buildings aren't homes. People are. Grace ran up, paint splattered on her clothes, eyes bright with excitement. Mrs. Whitmore, come see. We finished the mural in the greenhouse. Margaret let herself be pulled along, and Samuel followed, watching this woman who'd hired him to drive her through her grief now being led by his daughter towards something that looked like joy. The mural showed the Whitmore mansion, but reimagined windows thrown open, light spilling out, the gardens full of people of all ages and colors. In the corner, Grace had painted 3 figures standing together, a tall woman with silver hair, a man with kind eyes, and a little girl holding a golden bowl, carefully repaired. It's beautiful, Margaret breathed. It's us, Grace said simply. But more golden. The foundation's first-year anniversary fell on an October day so perfect it seemed staged. The estate grounds were hosting a harvest festival, with produce from the community garden being sold to fund the recovery center's programs. Samuel watched from the main house's steps as Grace, now 8 and chattering constantly, helped younger children with their kintsugi projects. Her grief hadn't disappeared, it never does, but it had transformed into something else. Empathy, creativity, a deep appreciation for small moments of beauty. Margaret stood beside him, no longer the stranger in the back seat, but something harder to define. Not family exactly, but not family either. They'd become to each other what kintsugi is to broken pottery, the gold that holds the pieces together. Making something new from the fragments of what was. I've been thinking, Margaret said, watching Arthur teach a group of teenagers how to properly serve tea. About what you said that first month, that we're all trying to control something in a world that proved we control nothing. I remember, I think you were wrong. She turned to him, and her eyes, once the color of grief, now held flecks of light. We can't control loss, but we can control how we respond to it. We can choose to become harder or softer, to build walls or gardens, to create more broken things, or to learn how to repair them. Mrs. Rodriguez called out from the garden, where she was teaching a salsa dancing class among the tomato plants. Margaret, Samuel, stop being so serious and come dance. Grace grabbed their hands, pulling them toward the music. Mom would have loved this, she said. And for the first time, mentioning Laura brought smiles instead of tears. As Samuel let himself be pulled into the dance, he thought about that newspaper ad from a year ago, the job nobody wanted at the house, nobody visited. He thought about how the worst moments of our lives can sometimes lead to the best if we're brave enough to keep driving through the storm. Margaret laughed as Mrs. Rodriguez corrected her footwork, and the sound echoed across the grounds that had been silent for so long. The Whitmore estate was no longer a monument to grief. It had become what Michael had always dreamed of, building a home where healing happens, where broken things are made beautiful, where the gold in the cracks catches the light and shows us that sometimes the repairs are the most precious parts. That evening, as the festival wound down and families headed home with baskets of vegetables and hearts full of community, Samuel stood in the driveway where he used to wait with the town car. Margaret and Grace were sitting on the mansion's steps, heads bent together over a new kintsugi project, a vase that would hold flowers for Michael's memorial garden. "Daddy," Grace called out. "Margaret says we can stay for dinner. Arthur's making his special lasagna. Every Sunday," Margaret added, and it sounded less like an invitation and more like a promise. "If you'd like." Samuel thought about their small apartment, with its thin walls and broken window. They still lived there. He'd refused Margaret's offers of financial help beyond his salary, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like what it was, a starting point, not an ending. "We'd like that," he said, walking toward them, toward this strange and beautiful family built from loss and gold, and the courage to keep repairing what's broken. As the sun set over Mystic, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the Whitmore estate glowed with warm light from every window. Inside, a little girl painted with watercolors, while a silver-haired woman and a tired but no longer defeated man watched, their silence now comfortable and full. Arthur hummed in the kitchen, preparing food for people he'd grown to love, and somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Michael and Laura were perhaps watching too, knowing that their loved ones had found a way to make beauty from the breaking. The job nobody wanted had indeed become the best decision of Samuel's life. Not because it saved him financially, though it had, but because it taught him that sometimes we have to drive through our grief with a stranger before we can find our way home. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, that stranger becomes the gold that holds our broken pieces together, making us not whole again, but something better, cracked and repaired and precious in our imperfection.